Okay. Well, good kind of midday to some of you. Good morning to others. I'm Ben Wright, Executive Director of Partnerships for the Instant Group for the Americas. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar, The Value of Sustainability. This is a really important emerging trend that the Instant Group is seeing and responding to. And I'm excited to have a great group of panelists to present that to you today. So just a quick reminder, the Instant Group is the largest global marketplace for flexible workspace. Flexible office operators work with us to open new centers, grow revenue, and improve margins. The goal of today is to talk about the importance of the availability of quality sustainability data for space operators, in particular, how to speak to members and potential members that are really making this a part of their space requirements. So we're going to cover what operators can do to help their members meet sustainability targets and what data is needed to effectively support today's members in their journey towards net zero. Leading us through today's session is Ali Lopez, Principal Consultant with the Instant Group. I think you're going to really enjoy hearing from Ali. Ali spends all of her time leading our Americas team, in particular consulting to companies, occupiers, and your members about their sustainability goals. So a really amazing opportunity. You're also going to hear from Mike Bascom, who's head of innovation growth at the Instant Group and a recognized expert in sustainability. You're also going to hear from Dan Schnitzer, who's the sustainability program manager for one of Instant's large occupier clients, Red Hat. I think you're going to hear it straight from your potential customers' point of view here, and we're really excited to be able to do that. So really specifically, Red Hat is the world's leading provider of enterprise open source solutions. You probably recognize the Red Hat brand from with the words open source, and he will provide the occupier's perspective. So we're just going to jump right in. I'm going to hand it off to Ali to take us through the session.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As Ben mentioned, our global sustainability team, as part of the Instant Group, really what we do is we're providing advisory and strategy support to both large corporate space users and space providers, all in the name of creating a smarter working world. And so whether a client is first starting out and they need help figuring out how to build an ESG strategy, or first defining what ESG even stands for and how that relates to corporate real estate, or perhaps they already have a more mature sustainability program and just really need that support actioning their strategy, we're working hand in hand as an extension of our clients' teams to help deliver outcomes that are actually moving the needle. So today, as Ben mentioned, we're going to talk about the current sustainability landscape, to talk about why it's so important to have quality data available, specifically as an operator, and then also talk through some of the ways that we're looking to bridge the gap between those who are using space and those who are operating space, all in the spirit of reducing pain points on both sides. We're also going to talk about using data as a decision-making tool to be able to identify those priority areas of focus so that organizations can move towards more mature sustainability programs that are actually making an impact. And since data is the name of our game today, I'm going to just quickly fly through some data points to set the scene, like the fact that 42% of all global greenhouse gas emissions have occurred in the last 30 years, or the fact that only 14% of people think businesses are being ambitious enough, and 38% believe that actually most businesses are making the climate crisis worse. So data helps us paint this clear picture of priorities for both consumers and for businesses. And it clearly demonstrates that consumers are demanding more accountability across the board from companies. And if we take a look here at just how consumers actually feel by generation, we can see that with each passing generation, from baby boomers down to Gen Z, they're caring more and more strongly about the climate and about businesses taking action. So data really, it helps us to understand where we should be focusing our priorities. You can see here, 76% of that youngest demographic that we just talked about say that a company's environmental policies would actually influence whether or not they work for that company. Data also shows us that the built environment itself should be a priority area for us to talk about when we're focusing on decarbonization. 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the built environment. more than half of all occupiers believe that ESG will have either a major or critical impact on their office strategies. And 3/4 of all occupiers think energy efficiency is actually the most important factor in their own ESG strategies. So it's clear just from taking a look at these statistics alone that sustainability in the built environment is a priority for space users, for emerging top talent, and most importantly, to be able to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And it's not just that youngest generation that feels this way. A recent Deloitte study of C-suite leadership showed that climate change was the second most important issue to address over the course of the next year, ranking above things like innovation, above competition for talent, above supply chain issues, and above global conflicts. So with that context in mind, we thought what better way to get insight into the priorities of members and space users than to hear directly from a large global space user themselves. And we are so lucky today to have Dan Schnitzer joining us. Dan, as Ben mentioned, leads Red Hat Sustainability Program as a part of their Global Workspace Solutions team. Red Hat is a cherished client of ours and also just a wonderful example of a large global company that has a significant hybrid and remote employee body, but also that utilize flexible office space to meet their space needs. So hello, Dan. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Allie. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, Red Hat is quite pioneering when it comes to your strategy around space use. So can you just talk a little bit about how Red Hat thinks about consuming space?
Sure. And I'll say it fits in perfectly with the Red Hat operating model and philosophy of being collaborative, being forward-thinking, and being open source. We're constantly evaluating and reevaluating how we can best serve our customers and how we can best operate to meet the changing needs that are out there. And certainly ESG is a big part of that. And so for us, especially as a software company, a large part of our global footprint is our real estate, since we don't have any direct manufacturing. And so what we're really trying to do is take a holistic look at what our footprint is and was and how we think about getting there. So we're shifting from determining our space needs based on headcount, which has always been kind of the traditional model, really to utilization. COVID has changed a lot. We've always had a strong remote workforce, but that has increased from COVID, and expectations have changed over time. And so looking at utilization, both actual and kind of realigning what those realistic goals are, enables us to have a much more nuanced approach to where our space is, how our space looks, and of ultimate importance, how much space it is that we're looking for. We've added in another layer to that, which is a deeper level of focus on what the space is primarily used for. So space is not space, whether it's the physical footprint or the build out. It really can be customized to its primary use, whether that's sales and customer facing, whether that's engineering, whether that's corporate centralized support. And that dictates how many conference rooms we need, how much public space we need. So really breaking it down by utilization and use into square footage enables us to be hyper efficient, which benefits both our bottom line and our environmental impact. All of that leads to a document we have called Work Your Way, which still says that flexibility, not just in terms of how much space you have at any given moment, but what that space can be used for, also rises to the top of ultimate importance. So how do we fit out that space? What furniture do we use? And again, how can we create possible spaces that are public when needed to be public spaces and private when they're needed to be private spaces? And really, you know, I would just say that this is an unsolicited pitch. You know, we do work with the Instant Group on our real estate portfolio to figure out how we can maximize that and what are the different options. And my learning curve is I'm traveling along that path. To me, flex space used to just be kind of the WeWork model. There's a desk available, and you can either rent it by the hour or by the month or whatever it is. Now understanding that there are changing opportunities for conference room space, for you know, using a whole section of an office, et cetera, really continues to provide opportunities for us to better hone in on a very specific mix of space that meets our needs most efficiently.
It's so interesting. It's great to hear that you're thinking about the way in which the spaces are used, not just the fact that you need a space, period. Can you talk a little bit about how that strategy then relates and plays a part in Red Hat's overall sustainability goals?
Certainly. So it starts with what our goal is, which is to reduce our operational emissions to net zero by 2030. For us, operational emissions are the emissions from our workspaces and from our data centers. We do a lot of work with our suppliers and downstream, but our ability to impact really is in that physical space that we operate and our data center utilization. And so within the space that we operate, I should clarify, we have 100% leased portfolio. And within that, there's some traditional leases and some flexible shared space. We call them MSOs. I don't know if that's an industry term or not, but managed service offices. And so it's really important, again, that we get the most environmental bang for our buck on these sites, that we are as efficient. And so what that means is not only only occupying the most efficient space we can, but what are the sources of emissions from that space? We look to providers who can provide us with renewable energy, with efficient equipment, both electricity and water, with waste services, ideally recycling and composting. And at a minimum, I would say, who have an openness to doing these things with us if they're not doing them already. But turnkey options where I get to have my input, turnkey options are definitely preferred because it makes our sustainability goals a lot more attainable. The other piece about that we look for, other than those kind of physical assets, is data. So all of our data gets aggregated up, and the more we move towards shared space, whether it's shared within a building or even shared within a floor, shared within an office in the MSO model, we need to have data on how much energy we're responsible for. So it can certainly get into the minutia and complicated. If is it by how many workers we have there? Is it by how many hours they spend there? But regardless, the more accurate data we get, the better it is and the better we can do. Because estimations, if we have to rely on them, really make it impossible to move the needle. If we're just saying, well, we've got 500 square feet in Cleveland, so let's look for the U.S. average or the Midwest average. It's not good data for us. It's a placeholder, and then we aren't motivated to make changes because the needle won't move, right? So why push the landlord to go with renewable energy, to put in LEDs instead of fluorescents, to have water efficient equipment, if we're always going to just rely on estimations? The people who have to fund the ideas that our sustainability team wants to put in, just say, hey, we did this, what's the payback? What's the advantage that we're seeing? With real data, though, and I'm talking about like actual metered data at our specific locations that we use, we can help be partners in making that the most efficient as possible. Short of actually metered data, access to building-wide bills with a proration for our square footage can suffice. And quite frankly, anything below that becomes really problematic for me to get behind in making these decisions.
I think that's such a good point. I think the two things that I held on to from what you just said are you can't manage what you're not measuring. So that's kind of a key tenet that I think is going to flow throughout this entire presentation. But it's hard to also adjust the programs that you have if you don't know how impactful they are. So I think that's a really important piece. And that partnership aspect is also really important because we don't all have it all figured out, but being willing to partner as operator and occupier is going to be a really important piece moving forward. Thank you for highlighting some of those barriers and those pain points, because I think they're felt across the board, on both sides. And so if you really were to just kind of get down to brass tacks, do you think that sustainability is actually a differentiator when you're looking for space? Like if you had two office spaces of kind of similar caliber in every other way, despite the availability of data, do you think that an occupier would actually pay more for access to that data for their own reporting?
I think so, yes. I can't sit here and say that sustainability, data, efficiency, and all of that is the number one or even the primary factor that goes into our decision making. And I don't think it is for any company. But I can say without hesitation that it is increasingly within Red Hat and increasingly within many other businesses becoming a factor on their scorecard and on their checklist. There's no doubt about that. And cost is an interesting thing. We used to see when in construction, when LEED and WELL were becoming more popular, that there was always that asterisk: what is the additional cost, and would people pay more? And what we're seeing now is that the marginal cost of LEED is minimal. In some cases, nothing, and in other cases, it's even cost competitive and cost advantageous. So I would take the financial difference kind of out of it, because the truth is that with one of the risks we didn't talk about was regulation that customers are facing both in the US and in the EU. And in the EU in particular, the reporting that we're required to do doesn't necessarily require that you own the space. So if you're leasing it, you still have to report and disclose on it. And that has downstream ramifications on your customers when they're asking for you what your footprint is, what are you doing towards sustainability, and throwing your hands up and saying, the landlord does nothing, but it's not my space, isn't going to get you very far as a supplier. And so I have no doubt that it is increasingly a decision-making factor, is a differentiator. And as more companies are out there doing this work, the better companies that we can partner with that are doing this on a holistic across the board level, we believe in this, the easier it's going to be to attract clients who also have sustainability goals, which again, it's all this big like domino effect. Having goals are more and more required by customers, by countries, by other regulations that are out there. And for those who might not want to jump into this work feet first, they will be pushed into this work. And so that space footprint and the emissions associated with it will just increasingly become important.
That's such a good point. And I mean, we're seeing that in real time on both sides of the coin. So it's only going to increase from here. I think that's such valuable input. Last question for you. I know you mentioned things like renewable energy. I know when we have conversations like this, perhaps the risk for someone who's more newly entering the sustainability world is that it's very jargony. It's very kind of pie in the sky goals and strategies. If you were to provide some specific examples of things that a space provider could actually do to get ahead of the curve and stand out to potential new members, you mentioned renewable electricity. What are some other things that they could do?
Yeah, I'll quickly just go a little bit deeper on renewable energy because I know that can scare some people off. The first option and the best option, obviously, is on-site renewable energy directly into the building. I also realize that could be cost prohibitive for some, and in large buildings might not even be that impactful if it's a high rise. But that is usually the best option. But there are options short of that. Many utilities can offer renewable energy directly through the utility. It's just changing your rate plan, not always more expensive. So looking into that as an option, and then an openness to buying renewable energy certificates to manage your entire building portfolio, or just for the resident or the companies that occupy it. Is something that we're looking for as well. We're doing a lot of that work with data centers. Outside of that, of course, there's the data issue, being able to provide data and as accurate and as direct for the use as possible. And again, it's not binary. I guess the no part is, but the yes could be like legit sub-metered, and it could go down from there to just by square foot, all the other stuff we mentioned. So it's really also that willingness to listen and hear what is needed and come up with a solution that works. And then there's the physical elements of it. It's efficient lighting, efficient HVAC systems, controllable HVAC and lighting systems by the space that is being used. It goes into some of these elements are in our Work Your Way manual, the type of paint that is used, no or low VOC paints, what is in the shared spaces, the type of furniture, off-gassing and no off-gassing furniture and fixtures that could go in. Certainly space accreditation goes a long way because you can cover a lot of that with one fell swoop of things like being well accredited or LEED accredited. And I will add that the human aspect that WELL brings to the table is also of increasing interest. There's building efficiency, but there's also the human health side of it that I think WELL exceeds at, whereas LEED, I think really excels, excuse me, at the building level. And so more and more employers, and I can certainly say for Red Hat, care deeply about the people that work in the spaces and not just the spaces as numbers on a spreadsheet. And so all of those elements tie into what sustainability is. And the more that we can have space owners providing that upfront and leading with that information, the more appealing they're going to look, certainly for us. And I have to imagine for many, many clients across the globe.
Thank you so much. So always so valuable, such a pleasure always hearing from you. Any last thoughts or things you want to share, Dan? Floor is yours.
I really appreciate being here. I appreciate that these conversations happen. I think it's indicative of where the market is heading. You know, no one has time to talk about the things that aren't happening. Yeah, we look forward to seeing how the market progresses in large part out of response to customers, but also because it's the right thing to do. And I don't think we can forget that in the work of sustainability, this is no longer a nice to have. From a business perspective, it's not a nice to have. It's increasing the requirement. And from an environmental and impact perspective, this is not just a nice to have. This is something we need to be doing for posterity, and we all have a role to play in that.
I love that. That's so impactful. If anyone has questions for Dan, please feel free to pop them in the chat. We should have time at the end for a bit of a Q&A at the end of our webinar today. But we'd first like to turn things over to you and ask you how frequently you're being asked for sustainability data by your members currently. So we've got a poll that should pop up on your screens. And feel free to answer this very honestly. If the answer is never, say never. It's a really good sort of snapshot of what things look like in the current moment. Give everybody a minute or so, and then we'll take a look. It'll also be, we did a similar webinar like this in the UK, and it'll be very interesting to compare markets and just see UK versus US American operators. What does that current landscape look like? Because the UK we've seen becomes a little bit like a crystal ball of things to come. So it'll be interesting to do that comparison. Give another maybe 10 seconds. All right, let's see what our results are looking like. Okay, interesting. So we've got about a split 40%, 40% regularly or sometimes, no on occasion, and 20% never. So this is actually, our group took a poll on what we thought this would look like, and that is not what it was. It's surprising, actually, that you are actually getting asked more frequently than we even thought would be the case. So follow up to that question is, are you then providing that data to your members, or is this a request that you're not currently able to fulfill? We'll give about 20 seconds for this, and then we'll pop those results up. All right, let's see what those answers are looking like. Okay, all right. So this is super interesting, right? This is exactly why we are doing this webinar, because people want to know how to do this, and sustainability is an incredibly complex thing. So we've got a split between we aren't doing it and people who are saying no, but tell us how to do it. So that is literally what we're about to do. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about things specifically from the operator perspective. What is the actual best way to engage with sustainability from where you sit? As operators, you have a very complex role. You have all of the responsibilities that come with operating a space. Then layer onto that the mounting expectations that come from regulations, as Dan mentioned, increased investor expectations, then add in requirements from your members to increasingly move to flex space and to meet their own sustainability and net zero targets. And all the meanwhile, you may have a team that's not yet educated enough on what it actually means to have a sustainability policy, or what data to provide when asked, or how to operate a sustainable space. So the risk then becomes that you're not actually properly equipped to provide the data that you are increasingly being asked for. As we talked about earlier, as Dan mentioned earlier, sustainability it's not a nice to have or a luxury anymore. It really is now just a requirement to do business. And providing space alone just isn't enough, because we're seeing supply surpassing demand, which leaves operators to compete over the space users. By 2030, office space demand is expected to drop 11% in London, 16% in New York, and 20% in San Francisco. And those who are consuming space are leaving their current spaces and flocking towards quality. And so sustainability data, providing that to your members and operating sustainable spaces become this key differentiator when it comes to the quality of your space. Members they're looking for solutions. And as you heard earlier, they're looking for partnership from their operators. The expectation is not that everybody has it figured out, but that you're willing to come to the table and look together for solutions. Because the reality is climate change is a complex situation that requires real corporate dedication to come up with those solutions. And companies across the board are just trying to stay competitive while they navigate the complexity of the situation. And again, as Dan mentioned, I'll parrot what he said because it does bear repeating. Things like hybrid work, a focus on the human aspect, that employee experience, but then also sustainability are increasingly dictating what corporate strategy looks like and guiding decision-making on where and how to work. If you look at the statistic here, 90% of people believe that a sustainable workplace design is good for both the planet and their well-being. 90%, that's an astounding statistic. So this is a real opportunity area for operators who can and want to be part of the solution by providing those types of spaces. So let's dive a little bit deeper and look at the actual opportunity on the table. If we take a look over the past 5 years, the number of companies that have publicly set carbon reduction targets that are based in science has increased by 36 times, up to almost 5,000 companies as of last year and growing. And when we say science-based, just for context, because again, this is where some of the jargon comes in, what we essentially mean is that these companies have officially submitted their own data and they have set targets to an organization called the Science Based Targets Initiative. And those targets are going to reduce carbon along a trajectory that lines up with what the latest climate science says is required to avoid the worst levels of catastrophic global warming. And again, using data as a guiding principle, what that actually means is that we are limiting the amount of global warming to a 1.5 degree temperature rise above pre-industrial levels. So just for context, when you hear science-based or net zero targets, that's what companies are actually talking about. And there is a very specific and data-driven trajectory that they are trying to get to, and they need the data to be able to accomplish their goals. Companies are also looking at their supply chains. So it's not just about direct emissions, but also about how you can influence the emissions of your suppliers and your partners to cascade that emissions impact down the full value chain. And as Dan mentioned, we're already seeing some companies make sustainability a requirement to continue doing business. They are increasingly voting with their wallets and making their preferences known through their buying power. So all of this points to the fact that sustainability really is this business advantage. By engaging in sustainable practices and by providing this data, you'll be able to build deeper relationships with your members, form that partnership, build those relationships with suppliers and partners, and ultimately grow your pipeline. Every board agenda also now includes sustainability. It is a priority topic, and it's also a topic area that people just on an individual level care really deeply and passionately about. So all that being said, to stay at that cutting edge of the competition, operators really need to capitalize on this movement by aligning with what members are asking for. And we'll turn it over again to everybody on the call today. Do you currently calculate your carbon emissions? We've got another poll that'll pop up. There we go. This one should be quicker. A binary yes or no. Give maybe 15 seconds and then we can take a look. All right, let's pop those answers up there and see what we've got. Okay, all right. So we've got about a quarter of our joiners today on the call in calculating carbon emissions. We've got about 3/4 say no, and that aligns with our previous poll where you want to be able to provide the data. The first step is calculating your own carbon emissions. And so we've got some solutions for you, and they are coming up in the next couple minutes. Perfect. So let's talk about why it is so important to talk about data and measure. As we heard from Dan, you absolutely cannot manage what you don't measure. Without access to data, we can't adequately measure progress towards those targets. We can't understand how sites are performing, and we can't then work towards reducing operating costs. So data is this critical first step to be able to then do all of the rest of the things that we want to do. So natural next question is then, how do you get this data? Well, 30% of landlords and occupiers agreed that using something like smart office technology to manage carbon emissions would actually be one of the most important factors in forming their ESG strategies. So the message here is that you don't have to go at this by yourself. There are available tools, technologies, and subject matter experts out there to help you figure out how to collect the data, what data to collect, and then importantly, how to use what the data tells you to make real environmental and positive financial impact. So this next slide is perhaps one of the most important in our webinar, in that it's essentially a cheat sheet of all of the things that your members are looking for in their ideal space when it comes to sustainability. It's more or less their holiday wish list. If your members are taking sustainability seriously within their own organizations, then they're going to care really deeply about everything on this slide. So just a couple for instances, you heard again about this from Dan, but again, bears repeating. Your members are going to want to put their employees in spaces that are powered by renewable electricity because it helps them meet their own goals. And as Dan said, the most impressive and sort of mature stance on this would be to actually produce your own renewable energy on site. Things like solar panels on roofs, on a parking garage structure, access to land, perhaps some wind turbines, rarer but possible. But you can also, as Dan said, work with your energy provider to see what green sources of power are available, and they're not always the more expensive option. And there are also things like grants and loans and other tax benefits available for much of what I just described to be able to support that larger transition to clean energy. Your customers and your members are also going to want you to work with suppliers who themselves are working towards decarbonization and towards sustainability. So some examples of things that you can do here are work with local suppliers, which helps reduce transportation emissions, or build sustainability terms into your contracts. This is something we help our clients do quite a bit. Waste is a really interesting one because from an emissions standpoint, it actually has a pretty low impact, but it is an incredibly visible thing. And so it's often seen as this proxy for how sustainable a space or a company is. And so things you can do here, make sure that each of your workspaces are set up with waste and recycling stations that are clearly labeled, clear signage. This also helps you reduce your waste management costs. And to meet your own waste goals over time, you will need to engage with the people using your space. So doing things like a waste audit or putting that clear signage up helps direct space users to be able to place items in the correct bin and source separate the right way. Operationally, doing things like installing controls to turn services off that aren't required after closing or that aren't needed based on occupancy can help improve the efficiency of your space. Or even something as simple as having a walkover process for your sites, which will identify and isolate plug load on a floor when it's closing. This helps to reduce something that we call vampire energy because the plug essentially sucks energy from the wall even when the electronic is off. And then, of course, lastly, the star of our show today, available data. So not only is that collecting and sharing that data, but communicating proactively to your space users, to your members, to use for their own reporting. And so with that, I will hand off to Mike now to talk about some of the key ways that we at the Instant Group are helping our operator partners tackle that data portion of this occupier wish list through a new product that we just launched called the Sustainability Index.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you so much, Dan, for coming on and giving us the occupier perspective of this as well. And it's something that we're very privileged in our position in the market. So between Incendium and Instant, we see how sustainability is treated across the entire value chain. So we work with the lenders, we work with developers, we work with operators and occupiers. And what's become very clear is firstly that sustainability, as Dan mentioned, to use his phrase, it's a business imperative now, but also it flows up and down that value chain very differently. And for operators in particular, there is this very, very specific need for data. And one of the core ways in which it adds value to operators is really to align operators with more closely to what the occupier needs are in this business environment that we're working in. So I've just come back from Porto, from Co-working Europe, which is this huge European-based operator festival, essentially. I don't want to call it a conference because that would be underselling it, but there were several things key themes that really came out of this. One is the need for differentiating. Firstly, this is a very competitive space right now. Everyone who's an operator needs some good, strong brand value. You need high occupancy. You need to be driving people towards your desks. Another one is things are pretty tough, if we're honest. Like everyone's operating on pretty thin margins right now. So we wanted to try and use data as a mechanism for creating value for operators. And really what we've done is try to embody that and use our scale as the Instant Group and use our platforms and our marketplaces to try and enable that. And what we've come up with is the Sustainability Index. And we know that obviously we've got this scale that previous slide just talked to, but realistically, the index unlocks data. It unlocks all this data that we've been talking about, because as these polls that have been fascinating to see the results come through in real time, and thank you everyone for contributing to those, people clearly want to be able to do the data, but getting it is a tricky thing. Now, what we have designed the index to do is first and foremost to unlock that data. So the advisory side of our business is particularly good at unlocking this data. We work with likes of Amazon, we work with Meta, we have the privilege of working with Dan and Red Hat and great folks like that. So we're good at being able to get data out of managing agents, out of landlords, and we take on the burden of that during this process. So even if it comes down to having to estimate the data, we know how to do that in line with the GHG reporting protocol. So that's how sustainability accounting is set up ultimately. Of course, actual data is where we try to get to first, but the very worst case scenario is we know how to estimate using the right methodologies. And that's where we come to the second step in this process. It's processing the data. So the data is all well and good once you get it, but how are you talking about it? How are you making it mean something to those occupiers, to people who need it down the line, and essentially add value to it in that sense? So it needs to be presented in line with the GHG reporting protocol. Now, again, this is where the alphabet soup that is modern sustainability comes in. The GHG reporting protocol is the closest thing we have to a universal standard. And I don't know if we sort of talked about scope 1 and scope 2 at all in this call, but essentially we align things with that. I won't go any more deep into the geekiness of it, but we present it in the right way. And after that, we then validate it. So obviously transparency is a huge part of sustainability to avoid greenwashing, but most importantly, just to get some actual useful data for yourselves to be able to act on, and for your occupiers to be able to act on. They need to be able to have validated data. So we cross-check all the data that is provided to us alongside the actual invoices wherever possible. So we do that. And then obviously it comes to what does what do you as an operator get out of this? And that's where the differentiation comes in. So everyone who goes through this process, and this is on an asset by asset level. This isn't something like B Corp or anything like that, which is just a corporate perspective. This is drilling down into the asset performance. You get two things ultimately. One is the asset report that comes with this. And this is a breakdown of the emissions and the usage and the consumption that comes with that specific site. Obviously, whether that's actual or estimated is very clearly marked out. And there's one other useful thing that we do with this as well, which is to give you the carbon per occupant data. Now, this is a new way of modeling which we're experimenting with, because what we found ultimately is the sort of the carbon per square foot way of looking at things, which is the traditional method. It doesn't really mean much anymore. Like, we've talked about occupancy, we've talked about that, how busy buildings are, and obviously that's a key factor for operators. And if you do it by square foot, you're essentially assuming that your building's full all the time, which it never has been, and it certainly isn't anymore post-COVID. So by looking at it in this unique way, we can actually make it more relevant. We can actually make it more contemporary and more useful. So you get that in part of the asset report, and it's a neat little unique insight into this. The second part is you get rewarded through differentiation on our websites. So we want occupiers like Dan to be able to go onto our platform and click on and say, right, well, I have a net zero target, I have carbon targets, I need to find suppliers who can support me in that journey. So on Instant Offices, you can now go and search directly for sustainable data providers, which are those sites that have passed our validation process, that we've validated everything works well. So on top of that, you get to stand out amongst the crowd. And ultimately, there are three outcomes for operators that the index does, and I'll finish with those. The first is it does create that brand value through aligning with sustainability. We know that you're going to be increase that brand recognition and brand value through talking about sustainability meaningfully with validated, assured data. Secondly, it's going to drive your occupancy higher, and that's done through that differentiation. You will stand out more in a very competitive marketplace. And lastly, it is going to help with those operating margins that we know are pinching everyone right now. With us taking on the unburdening of unlocking that data for you, that's something that you don't have to worry about in terms of cost or resources. It's all baked into what we do. So that's been our approach, and we're very keen to drive as much interest as we can towards the index, because we really want to start using it to really push the data boundaries across the whole sector. We know we're not good enough at this yet, so come join us. And if anyone wants more information from any of us on anything we've discussed today, please get in touch.
Thank you so much, Mike. And we've got 1 minute for Q&A. So if you've got any questions, we've got one already that I'll ask to Dan and Ali. So this comes from Jennifer Blanco. Dan and Ali, thanks so much for the great overview. I wanted to ask if there was a particular sustainability project that you're most proud of, either that you worked on together or separately. So Dan, I'll have you start with that answer.
Sure. I know it said one, two kind of come to mind. One is a point that Ali made earlier, which is about things that are very visible. We've had some good wins in Boston, where a big portion of our corporate leadership team sits with getting them reusable lunch containers for their lunch program. So again, environmentally, it's relatively small and it's not going to show up on a report anywhere, but it makes a huge difference to have our corporate leaders using reusable lunch containers. And I know that's not quite relevant to this call, other than to say I do believe Ali's point is incredibly important, that the little things matter and what it looks like matters. On a slightly more relevant way, we've recently developed a relationship with one of our data center partners, where they are cost sharing in the purchase of renewable energy certificates for our consumption on their site. And that is just an example of a true partnership that, again, where and when my voice is able to be heard in whatever volume it's able to be heard at on decision making, they will have my full support from a sustainability perspective, as what a real partner is and the type of people we want to grow with.
That is exactly the example that I was going to give in the spirit of building that partnership. I think it's exactly the same type of partnership that occupiers are looking to build with their operator partners. So literally took the words out of my mouth.
Great. And then last question to wrap it up is actually for you, Mike. what's the time frame to implement the sustainability program if an operator is interested in it today?
Right. No, thank you. And thank you, Stephanie, for asking that. So it's live now. We are working, we've already got over 3,000 assets on the index program to date. So we're well set up to do that. We aim, it depends on how many sites that the operator is listing, but we can certainly send out a pack specifically on this, but we aim to get from receiving the data to the differentiation and the badge awarded on instant offices. We're aiming to get that done in about 3 weeks. So it's quite a quick process, and hopefully we can help you out.
Awesome. Well, I want to give a real thank you to Ali for presenting, for Dan for really sharing Red Hat's story, for Mike really bringing this product to market, and thanks to all the operators that attended today. And if you do have any follow-up questions, you've got our contact information, and looking forward to partnering with you on this journey, which is an important one for the industry, for your businesses, as well as for the planet.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.